Hello, everybody, and thank you for taking the time to join us. Today, we're going to be learning about the potential for energy storage to help integrate renewables and to make the grid more reliable in Israel. I'm Andy Colthorpe, editor of Energy Storage News at Solar Media. Just 7 years ago, around the time I started out writing about renewable energy as a journalist with PV Tech, Solar Media's solar photovoltaics website, Israel was inaugurating its first true utility-scale solar farm at 10 megawatts, and I would hear about Israel as a country with a great potential for renewable energy that was yet to be shown to the world. But as you're about to hear from our three expert speakers in this webinar, things have changed a lot since 2013, and the pace of change is about to increase dramatically. In the past, renewable energy had been considered a low priority area for government policy, and we often heard of confusing or sometimes contradictory regulatory issues. So while Israel receives abundant, plentiful, unbroken sunshine on many days of the year, the country's potential for solar PV has largely gone untapped. Well, not only have the policy and regulatory space changed, but as readers of Energy Storage News and PV Tech will know, the pace of cost reduction and technology innovation in the storage and renewables industries have reached the point where they can truly change the world and are already doing exactly that. Renewables are the cheapest form of new power generation in areas where 2/3 of the world's population lives, and energy storage is one key to making those renewables a cornerstone of an even more reliable system than we had before. In this webinar, we are going to hear firsthand how up to 8 gigawatt hours of energy storage could ultimately be used to support national goals, including 12 gigawatts of solar deployment. And we are going to hear how, if you're an independent power producer, provider of technologies or related services, you participate in Israel's energy transition future today, beginning with the second round of solar+storage auctions. First, we will hear from Eitan Parnass, who has for many years championed the cause of clean energy and is the founder and head of the Green Energy Association of Israel. After Eitan explains some of the big picture topics that show us the direction Israel is going in, Michael Salomon, CEO of expert consultancy Clean Horizon, will lead us through some of the details and main features of the new tenders and auctions that Israel is hosting. Finally, we are very happy to welcome Yossi Sokoler, Head of Regulation at the Electricity Authority of Israel, who is going to explain more about the design of the tenders and the authority's views on how energy storage will be vital for Israel's cleaner energy future. As always with our webinars, please put your questions for the speakers in the tab on the right-hand side of your screen, and then following their three presentations, we will do our best to answer as many of them as possible in the Q&A session that follows. So without further ado, over to our first speaker, Eitan Parnass.
Thank you, Andy. It's a pleasure to be here. My presentation will go into Israel electricity market with a focus on renewables. You know, Israel is located in a very strategic place in the Middle East. We are not interconnected to any of our neighbors. We are an energy island. I will get back to this. Some basic facts about Israel. It's a small country of 9 million people, only 72 years old, AA minus ranked economy. It's quite astonishing, a miracle in this area of the world, and we are doing very well also in facing the COVID effects. The Israeli economy is stable. We've got a very nice economic growth here in Israel, a growth rate of around 3%. The demographic rate is also outstanding. If you compare it to European countries, it's almost 2% of demographic growth rate, and of course it has to do also with electricity consumption in the end of the day. Israel is very well known for innovation and startups. In Israel, you can find much of the big brands, the big names of IT and technology in Israel. They are located here, research centers, and also business activity of the biggest corporations doing with innovation and startups here in Israel. We are quite a modern country. If you haven't visited Israel, this is the Israeli skyline. You are more than welcome to come and visit Tel Aviv. We're doing our best here in Israel to actually push forward, and we've managed in the past 70 years to do a lot. Israel is, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of security, in other terms, we are really a developed country, part of the OECD, of course. Now, going to the Israel electricity market, we are an electricity island, and talking about storage, of course, it makes a lot of difference. If you are an electricity island, and we rely mostly on solar, you can understand how important is flexibility and storage for us. The electricity demand growth rate in Israel is around 2%. We have in total 17 gigawatts of fossil generation. We have introduced private IPPs here in Israel some few years ago and already reached 40% of the electricity in Israel is produced by private IPPs of natural gas. We actually managed here, in a big luck for us, to find natural gas. Some would say it's not such a big luck because gas is now fading away, hopefully. So in Israel, we actually managed to find one of the biggest finds of this area, and Israel is relying on natural gas. It's a base load here in Israel is natural gas. You can see the figures, 64%, whereas 36% is coming from coal generation, which is diminishing. In terms of irradiance and sun hours, Israel enjoys very good conditions, 330 sunny days. We were here in Israel pioneers of solar energy. Some of the 94% of Israeli households are actually covered by solar rooftops. You can see this is the Israeli landscape of rooftops here. And this is our first prime minister standing aside in the 50s by a solar heater here that was actually invented here in Israel. So today we've actually managed to reach in Israel, by the end of this year, we will reach 8%, whereas the goal to reach was 10%. So we are actually lagging behind, but things are changing and you will see the big changes now. In terms of policy here, for many years, the Ministry of Treasury actually controlling the electricity market was against subsidy. They are very strict about it, and they didn't allow renewables to grow when it was subsidy. This, of course, has changed, and actually from the year 2015, we see a U-turn, a shift in the policy. But looking at the timeline of Israeli electricity market development, in 2009, the first goals were introduced for renewables here in Israel. Up until 2013, nothing really much happened. It was almost 2% renewables in Israel because the opposition of the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of the actually responsible for the economics of Israel. So they didn't allow subsidy, but things have changed in 2013 when the prices of solar system became good enough for the economy to accept them, and the Ministry of Treasury actually embraced them. So the first net metering scheme was actually introduced in 2013. In 2015, this is the COP21, the climate pact in Paris. Of course, we were part of it, and we actually submitted our goals. The goals actually submitted were 17% by 2030, and the other midterm goals that you can see here. Something really important happened here in Israel, and this is a big factor for any electricity market player. In 2018, after 20 years of struggling with the monopoly here in Israel, we have an IC, Israel Electric Company monopoly. The monopoly actually was broken apart. It's under legislation. It was enacted. In 2018, the government managed actually to pass a law with a new reform. And as we speak, a lot of good things happens in Israel, including the creation of a new governmental TSO and the Grid Operation Management Unit. It's a governmental entity company, and they are now under construction. So a lot of good things is happening in Israel. The monopoly is no longer a part of the generation of Israel. They are still controlling the distribution, but a monopoly in Israel, it's now history. We are undergoing a reform in the electricity market, and we have waited for many years for this to happen. In 2020, something really good happened to us. It's the government acknowledging that we can do it, and we can do it economically and in the right way. The government actually decided just 2 weeks ago to enlarge the goals for Israel to 30% by 2030. We're talking about 12 gigawatts of solar PV. From the 30%, 26% is solar PV, and this is 12 gigawatts. And we also have a midterm 20% goal by 2025. So this has happened really recently, and the government is now embarking on the implementation of those decisions. If we look about some official data from the PUA, Public Utility Authority, you can see the nice constant growth of renewables in Israel. You don't see any peaks here because from 2013, you can see how the government is implementing cautiously integration of renewables here in Israel. And later on, when you're interested to see the different segments of implementation, you can go into details with the chart below the presentation. We will share it, of course, later. If we talk about the data here from what is happening in Israel in the past three years, actually the treasury controller in Israel was very convenient with auctioning. This is the right way to do it if you talk about economics. And they actually went out with 3 different kinds of auctioning for land, for rooftop and reservoirs. And when you're talking land distribution and also a transmission scale, and the one that is of interest to you is the last distribution land auction plus PV storage. I would not go into too much details. You can see the figures here. This is the numbers in the dollar cents and the Israeli agorot. Michael Solomon, presenting after me, will go into details about this auction, and of course Yossi Sokoler from the PUA will discuss it in depth. Some pictures for you from Israel. This is the first land scale distribution aside the Keturah kibbutz in the southern part of Israel. This is our Knesset. The Israeli parliament is the biggest parliamentary rooftop solar in the world. We were the ones to actually push it for many years until it happened. This is a stadium in Jerusalem, this stadium, some implementation in reservoirs. Reservoir is a very growing segment here in Israel, aside the reservoir and also on top of the reservoirs. We have also CSP. I will not go into details about it, but we have 2 impressive CSP parks in Israel. And some large-scale PV, you can see the Chalutziot 55 megawatts and the 120 megawatts of Tzelim plant. To summarize it all up, Israel is a growing renewables market. It's a solar PV focused with great irradiance figures. We're talking about 12 gigawatts in the next 10 years to come, less than 10 years. And there's a 7 gigawatts midterm goal for photovoltaics by 2025. We see a government which is pro-renewables, pro-PV. The main obstacles were removed. Subsidy concern of the treasury is no longer there. The treasury is in favor of solar, and it looks how it's going to affect the price and decrease the tariffs for the public. The IEC market reform is behind us, and this is a very healthy thing to happen to the Israeli market. We do see a growing fossil-free public opposition movement. People don't want to see NG power plant, natural gas power plants being built around their cities, and there's a great opposition here managing to actually cancel some of the planned IPPs, and this is happening as we speak. It's a big issue now in Israel. So Israel is an energy island. We don't have any hydro. I didn't mention it, but don't look for the Israeli dams or the big water streams. It's not here. It's almost a desert here. We have a very limited wind capacity. Israel is also is located on the main migration path for birds flying from Asia to Europe and back. So there's an environmental issues. So to make it all up, this is a rapid energy storage market, electricity storage market. I didn't mention energy security, but it is a big issue here in Israel. We will need a lot of storage. We need the energy security. We need the flexibility to allow those gigawatts of PV coming into the grid and being administered the right way. And I will be my organization. We are open for any further information you will require. You can communicate with us, and we will be very, very happy to assist your requests. I will now shift to Michael Solomon. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Eitan. Thanks for the great presentation. So, very pleased to be here. Thank you to the team at Solar Media for hosting us on this webinar. So my name is Michael Salomon. I run a company called Clean Horizon that I'll introduce just now, and then I will talk to you a little bit more about that latest auction that Eitan mentioned, the so-called distributed land auction PV plus storage number 1, which yielded 168 megawatt peak of PV. So I'm going to discuss it. That's the one that we just finished, and I'll tell you about the number 2 of that auction, which is currently open. And then the next speaker there will be talking about the future. So in a nutshell, my company's Clean Horizon is very simple. We are a one-stop shop energy storage consultant. So what does that mean? We are A, only working on energy storage. B, we're consultants. So we don't sell energy. We're selling services. And C, we're one-stop shop. So this means, what kind of service do we sell? Well, all of them, meaning mostly market analysis and technical consulting. So on a technical consulting level, that means that we will do the design of storage plant or storage plus whatever plant, all the way up to the procurement support. And clearly, of course, when there's an open auction for storage or PV plus storage or hybrid systems, where we try to be as useful and helpful as we can with IPPs and utilities that leverage us. In terms of our achievements so far, I think this was done in July. This is just a quick aggregate of all the projects that we've worked on. There was about 60 projects in probably about 25 countries that we had worked on as of July 2020, which represented about 1.7 gigawatt hour of storage. And it took us 10 years to get there, but I would not be surprised that if that number is double next year. Clearly, the pace of deployments all around the world its acceleration is accelerating. Let's put it this way. Okay, so first point is, I believe that, I'm pretty sure that in the audience today, we have people that were involved successfully or unsuccessfully in the previous tender, the so-called, I'm going to say its name for the second and last time, the distributed land auction PV plus storage number 1. So let's call it the first PV plus storage auction in Israel. That auction, for those of you that have missed it, here's what you've missed. You've missed, okay, 168 megawatt peak of PV may sound small, but probably 672 megawatt hour of storage actually does sound big. If you look at the latest, one of the biggest storage auction, PV plus storage auction in Europe, that was in Portugal just this summer, and roughly 100 megawatt of storage was selected. And although the amount of megawatt hour is not disclosed, we do believe, because we've worked a lot on that Portuguese tender, we do believe that the amount of storage in terms of megawatt hour was probably 4 or 5 times smaller than the one you have in front of you. So that's first thing, is the amounts, the size of this first opportunity was big. Well, I'm sorry you missed it, but the good thing is there's another one that's open. But now the second thing that's super duper hyper relevant there is that PV plus storage auction was awarded through a fixed rate PPA. Actually, I think it was inflated, I'm not sure, but let's call it fixed rate. Maybe Yossi will correct me afterwards. So essentially no merchant risk, and essentially your PPA is backed off by a government-owned entity. And as Eitan just mentioned it, the government of Israel is essentially a AA minus entity, which is not as good as it gets, but I guess sufficiently great. So this is huge, but it's going to get huger, if I may use that that word that I just made up. And in terms of what the future holds, again, Yossi will give orders of magnitude which are astonishing for a small country like this one. Now, like I said, there's a second of those PV plus storage auction that's open right now. As a matter of fact, it's open until late December, which means you can go online, Google it, and download it. Actually, don't Google it, because Google, sucks all your private data. So you can just go online, find it, and then bid, essentially. And if you don't find it, you can just ask any one of the speakers. I'm sure they'll be happy to provide a link to you. Now, what does the standard say? Well, the standard says, first of all, it's PV plus storage. We're not talking, standalone storage, frequency regulation, blah, blah. No. It's PV and storage. Second point, so what I call the financial overview. Well, how does it work? Well, it works the following way. It's a PPA until December 2045. Well, see what the bidding entity there did is smart. They told the bidders, well, technically, yes, we're giving you a 25-year PPA, but if it takes you 7 years to permit your project, it's only an 18-year PPA. So basically, what they're telling the bidders is, we'll give you that money for a long time. Just rush up and make sure you expedite the deployment of that project. So I think it's a very smart way to do, as opposed to a fixed term PPA. And so the way this works is, each of the bidder bids a price which is linked to, let's say, its cost of energy plus margin plus their IR, and then all of those offers are ranked. And in Israel, they have this way so they provide a marginal clearing price for all of the ones that are selected. It's the only specificity, I guess, is that the clearing price is not the price of the last selected. I think it's the price of the first one not to be selected, but whatever, just another way to set it up. Essentially, it's a clearing price. So now, in terms of sizing, and I'll get back to this in more detail in just a minute. Well, the way this works is, you get your land. First of all, you add the distribution level, and then you find your land. You put as many megawatt peak DC as you can permit, as you can, or as you want. And then issue there is, you are limited in the export capacity. I said the limiting factor of each project is its interconnection agreement, its export capability. So it's not the land, even though it's a small country. The limitation is the export capability. And what they're saying is, for each megawatt AC of export capability, we ask you to put 4 megawatt hour of storage. And in terms of this charging strategy, they're making your life easier than in most jurisdictions, because they're telling you, you don't have to charge from the PV. As a matter of fact, you can charge from the grid, and to be quite transparent, we'll even pay some of the, let's say, very high, we'll say a very high proportion of the storage losses, without getting into too many details at this point. So essentially, you don't need to be too smart about how to charge your storage, which relieves a burden which takes away a burden from the shoulders of the operator. Now, I created that slide, and I said it's a surprising scheme. So what's surprising? Well, first of all, it's surprisingly simple. Usually, storage is all about being smart. It's all about being complicated, complex, and trying to co-optimize multiple things, which, by the way, is usually very good news for me, because what we sell is trying to make our client's life simpler. Now, why is that surprising? First of all, even though you may have seen or participated into tenders that are for storage, firstly, no, it's not like in the US, where you're like in the vertically integrated parts of the US, the so-called regulated parts of the US. It's not about owning and force the battery system and making it available to the utility to do whatever the hell they want with it, as long as they don't go over a certain amount of cycles per day and or per year. Right now, the application, the way the battery is going to be used is already known, if you wish. The actual discharge cycle is not known, but the type of usage is known. It's not going to be for frequency regulation and or balancing and or arbitrage. You don't have this kind of uncertainty there. So it's not like you're owning a system that should be owned by the utility, except that they don't have the cash and they're asking you to own it. No, it's not this way. Number two, it's not like you have in most places, I would say, in the so-called deregulated parts of the US or more commonly in Europe, where you would have a 1, 2, or 4 storage system that's dedicated to essentially bidding on multiple markets. We know that in Europe, we know that we don't have with storage fixed, we don't have feed-in tariffs anymore. We don't have fixed rate PPA for storage. And so we have to, the operator of the storage system has to, every day, every hour, every week, every month, place bids on multiple markets and try to optimize its revenue, and while serving the grid in the best way as possible. That's nice. Those are nice and very efficient, but unfortunately, of course, very unbankable, because those kind of construct bears very high merchant risk. So it's not like that at all, and it's not even like we had seen, back in the early days in the French Islands, or like is the case in multiple, I'd say, vertically integrated jurisdictions, or maybe like in some parts of the US. So we're not directly speaking about having an asset whose goal it is to be, I would say, managed 100% with the goal of reducing the level, the cost of energy on the given jurisdiction. For those of you that remember or that are still involved in the French Islands, those ones are a very typical example, where you had essentially formulas that were giving you a bonus if you were discharging your battery at specific times. So the whole difficulty of those standards was to have an energy management solution able to make the optimal decision at every time step. So based on what it's not, and given the previous slide that was describing what the standard is, the way we understand and we interpret the standard is essentially, this is mostly the best way to understand the standard, according to me personally, is to see that in this standard the storage is used to supplement the grid. Basically, we're saying, look, a grid cannot export as much PV as we cannot absorb as much PV as we would like. We're going to reinforce it locally at every project location with storage, and therefore we can put as much, we could put much more DC, megawatt DC of PV for each megawatt of interconnection, and therefore we can integrate more renewable in our country. So, it is open for interpretation. I'm pretty sure I will face this agreement, but that's life. So now, once you have that, okay, so it looks simple. It's not that simple, I would say. And so I'm just giving here a few pointers to discuss what could be questions to ask yourself as a bidder if you want to optimize that bid of yours. So number one, this is PV plus storage. You're in Israel with 1900 or so sun hours per year. Yes, now you need to ask yourself the question: does it make sense to have a DC-DC coupling between the PV and the battery, or should I go with the more usual AC coupling between the PV and the battery? Forget the text here; it's too long. But if you just look at the little schematic there, it sets the point. It sets the issue quite simply. Or you can also look at the graph beforehand. Essentially, the advantage of a DC-DC coupling is it helps you recover energy, the orange energy in my graph, which would have been otherwise curtailed. And of course, there's a little less losses because you only go through one conversion stage when you recharge your battery, as opposed to two in the AC coupling. However, the drawback of DC coupling is that the assets there are a bit less off the shelf and the capex is higher. So the first question to ask yourself is: do I go DC-DC or do I keep AC coupling? second point, I mentioned earlier that yes, so the actual ratio of megawatt peak DC divided by the interconnection, the AC interconnection capability at each project, it's probably not going to be the same one as it is in other countries, simply because the regulator has forced us to put storage on the essentially at the transformer level. So given the tariff that you expect, given the radiation in Israel, given of course well, the fact that there's storage, as I mentioned, and of course then the shade and all the specific shape of your site, what's the optimal ratio? And that's something to be very carefully studied, I would say, to establish the lowest tariff. And of course, to keep on trying to decrease your tariff, the last question to ask oneself is to say, okay, well, this is going to last for as long as 25 years, right? Because it expires on December 2045. Well, if you're going to do it with batteries, batteries don't stand 25 years. So you're going to have to think of what's your optimal replacement strategy. I gave two examples in this chart, which is just, they're theoretical here, which is essentially, do I completely oversize my system on year one, by the way, finishing on year 15, but it's just an example, or do I keep on oversizing until every 7 years on this graph, and so I can keep my capacity all the way through year 25? And there's multiple other ways you can think of, but so basically you're going to need to ask yourself those questions now so that you can place the most optimal bid. Now, as a segue to the next speaker, who, by the way, he's one of the most important persons in Israel if you want to understand what is in the standard, because as far as I know, he's kind of like the guy who wrote it. So you absolutely need to listen to him, all the more so that he has no slides. So wake up, stop doing whatever it is that you're doing. You got to listen to Yossi. So what I want to say, just to entice you to listen to him, in case I was unsuccessful up to now, is just to sort of lay the groundwork, to lay the foundations for what he's going to say, which is essentially what are the incoming opportunities in this country. Number one, I just mentioned, there's this auction number 2, PV plus storage auction number 2. Remember, the first one cleared out at 672 megawatt hour, which is not negligible. Yossi will discuss the fact that they're also thinking on, I would say, on standalone storage for their country, and there's also elements to be discussed probably behind the meter, optimizing the actual tariff that they have in this country, to phrase it simply. So without further ado, I'll let Yossi speak, and please listen to him, because he's going to discuss orders of magnitude, and then you'll have questions. Thank you.
So thank you, Michael. So after this introduction, I hope I'll make your time worthwhile. So I'm glad everybody's here. Before I start, I would like to thank you guys for the opportunity to show the Israeli case and maybe interest you to come and bid in our country, because for us it's a great opportunity. And I think, like every regulator, we like to see a competitive market with a lot of participants. So for us, it's a real advantage to be able to show what we did and what we're planning. So again, thank you. So as Michael said, I will talk a bit about our upcoming opportunities in storage, and what's on the horizon. Before I do so, I will address a bit how we see this PV plus storage tender. And first of all, I will address, Michael wondered if it's indexed or if it's so yes, we're indexing to the Israeli CPI, and you can choose the indexation of to the dollar or to the euro by your choice. So this is just for information. And I think it would add to what Michael already showed very successfully about our tender. I think there's another benefit that we saw in this tender and in the way we tendered the PV plus storage the last time and the upcoming auction on December. So first of all, like Michael said, we see a great advantage of the enlargement of the DC side, because you actually take better use of the grid. You on the same grid capacity, you bring us more PV and by quite a lot. And this is for us a very important thing in the Israeli context, because we do have a congested grid, and it's a pretty crowded country. It's pretty small, and we have a lot of people, so it's harder to do a large infrastructure as grid. So any better use of the grid is important for us. But on top of that, we set a mechanism in this tender saying the DSO actually has a right to ask for an energy demand. He has an energy demand that is limited. He can't do whatever he wants, but he has an energy demand that he can ask for to be injected to the grid. For give an example, he can ask for the energy to be injected to the grid between 6 in the evening and 10 at night, and the PV plus storage will have to follow the demand. And it doesn't prohibit of injecting more energy to the grid, but you will have to follow the energy demand. We set the demands or the limitation on the demands as such that can always be followed, even if on some days that there is no sunshine, you will have to charge a bit from the grid, but mainly you will be able to follow the instructions with your PV that was stored and just inject it when it's important. So by doing so, not only that we save the grid infrastructure, we also think that we save the next peaker power plant, or let's say in more general, we save some capacity. So for us, it's eating the cake and keeping it whole. So we like this sort of tender. And so looking forward, after saying what I said about this kind of tender, so I think this is something that we're planning to stick with, at least for the meanwhile. We see it coming along. Just putting it in context about how much storage do we need. So Eitan talked about our goal of renewable energy by 2030. So looking at that goal and deriving the capacity needed in all sorts, but let's talk about storage, we would need over 2,000 megawatt of storage with 4-hour capacity, meaning more than 8 gigawatt hour of storage. I think this is for a country like ours, it's a huge challenge. And I think this means that we have to start taking whatever we can. In the sense, we're now going to do a lot of regulation focused on storage. And so this is what's going to be here in the next several years. And how are we going to do it? So we can divide it into 3 main objectives or ways. So one we talked about extensively is PV plus storage, and actually just tendering out the PV plus storage. We may enlarge it from the distribution level to the transmission level as well. But I think this is something, a prominent way to promote the storage in Israel. We may change it with time to fit more the energy market that we are building coincidentally, and when we feel it's ready, we may coincide, but I think this will be something that will stick with us. Another way that we already started thinking of is standalone storage on the transmission level, the big bulks of storage, let's say. And I think there that we're more advanced than other cases. What we did here, we heard the public about the way that we are thinking of regulating the standalone storage. We are after a public consultation, and now we are in the stage of processing everything we got, and we hope to set the regulation for how storage standalone works in Israel, and I hope this will be in the next year. I didn't say, and I should have, in the PV plus storage, we have another tender coming up in Dimona. It's a tender that is held by the Ministry of Finance, and in the next few months, this tender will be online. It's a tender for a 500 megawatt PV plant plus around 200 megawatt hour storage. So I think it's a very large project, very interesting. Unfortunately, it was already PQ, so if you're not in the PQ, you cannot participate, but it's nice to know and maybe see other tenders that will come online in that. So we talked about PV plus storage, we talked about standalone. Let's talk a bit about behind the meter. So we have a tariff named TAOZ, or time of usage tariff, that was set in 2010. Obviously, when it was set, it didn't take into account the change of the capacity of specifically the integration of so much PV, as Eitan said, and the times that were set as peak prices were in the new, because Israel is a hot country and we use a lot of air conditioning, and our peak demand is usually at summer noontime, and so therefore we wanted you to not consume in those hours. But obviously, when we're integrating so much PV, our focus will move from noon to the afternoon or evening, and I think this movement itself can create interesting opportunities for storage, because if you have already so much PV, and PV we hope will get cheaper, now you have to move what you produce to the hours that it counts. So I think that in the next year or two, I hope we can change the tariff scheme, and I think this will give an opportunity to storage, and I think this will be another opportunity. I think these are the main three ways. I think in general, we're trying to not set so much the technology the way you do it, but try to take a step back. And I think this is all I have to say. Again, thank you for the opportunity. And I'll move back to Andy. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Yossi, and of course to Eitan and Michael as well. So all our speakers are joining me now on the virtual stage for the question and answer sessions, and I've seen it's been very lively. We've got more than 200 people have joined us for this session, which is terrific to see. Some familiar names as well from around the industry, where we can see who's on. And so, yeah, we've had lots of questions as well. So let's see how many of these we can get through in the 20 minutes or so that we have allotted. We had lots of questions, and lots of really good questions, I think, guys, didn't we? So first of all, let's start off with the easy one, I guess. What's the installed capacity growth of solar in Israel so far? And that's from John Bloom. And also I saw there's a related question from James Trudeau of what is the storage goal by 2030 for Israel? So I don't know if Eitan, you want to maybe just talk briefly about the solar side of things, and Yossi, if you'd like to take it from there on the storage side, I guess.
Hi. I think in terms of installed capacity of photovoltaics, we are talking about almost 3 gigawatts. We don't have the numbers yet, and we should count them by the end of this year. The target goal was 3.5 gigawatts. So we will not reach 10%, so we are around 8% maybe. So this is the figure. The other question, Andy?
Oh, sorry, yeah. Well, okay, well, just before we move on to the second question, which was kind of about what the storage goal is, or by 2030, there was a question here that, I don't know if it's controversial or not, but Stanislav Cherevetsky would like to know, why has it taken so long, he says, for the government to start that transition towards renewables? And that can be either a long answer or a short answer.
Okay, I actually mentioned it in my presentation, and if it was not clear enough, we had two main obstacles: the economics and the anti-subsidy policy of the Treasury. This is already solved. Of course, with the Israeli radiance, economics makes sense here from 2013. And the other obstacle was the IEC monopoly, which for 20 years didn't agree to undergo a reform, and this was also solved in 2018. Now, this is one of the reasons that you cannot find too many Israeli international players here in Israel. Mm-hmm. This is also a good chance for newcomers, but up until now we had very few, like EDF Energy Nouvelle, EDF Renewable Energy is active here. as an international player, but many of the other big players are not here. And maybe now when things get stable, we will see also a change in this.
Sure, okay. Yeah, so the next question was from James Trudeau. And
yes, in terms of the goal for storage, the new governmental transmission manager is actually preparing a regulatory scheme for storage. The numbers are already there. It's we will need actually 2 gigawatts, and in total it's 8 gigawatt hour of capacity here by 2030. This should be also approved by the Minister of Energy and the PUA. Maybe Yossi can say something, can elaborate on that. But it's already, we know the numbers because we know the numbers of photovoltaics and we know the flexibility aspect. So we can actually, we know the numbers should be around that kind of capacity.
sure, and your point of view?
Yes. So I would just like to add to what Eitan said. We have to differentiate what's a governmental goal and what is its what comes out of that goal. So the government set a goal of 30% renewable energy by 2030. As a result of that goal, we expect it to be needed around 8 gigawatt hours of storage by 2030. So it's not a goal, because if you have different technologies or anything, you can do it in different means. But when we assess our needs to 2030, that would be the number I would, for now, note the quote.
Right, so it's like, rather than, because as we've seen in the US, there's about 7 states in the US now that have storage targets or mandates that are set in stone. I think Spain is coming up with 2.5 gigawatts target by 2030. But what you're saying is it's not a specific target for energy storage. That's more what you're thinking will be required in order to integrate that capacity of renewable energy.
Exactly.
Okay, sure. So there's an interesting question here from Hector Valdez, and I guess, we can get more onto specific storage stuff as we go through these, but Hector asks, what are the technical challenges expected for introducing so much solar into an island grid, and do you have a limit of penetration of that solar? And yeah, Michael, did you want to have a
Sure. I can give a hint. So the question there is actually very generic. Indeed, Israel is not an island. Obviously, it's a continental piece of land, but it's an electrical island, and as such, they're facing the same kind of issues that other islands are facing, namely actually issues with stability and issues with I guess the cost of energy, except that in their case it's a fairly big island in terms of capacity installed. I think Eitan mentioned about, I think it was 17 gigawatt. So that's in general what they're going to be facing. Now, I haven't read seen any information or any publication from the PUA or from the IEC regarding specific stability issues or specific issues with the maintaining the frequency in Israel. The way I see, we are not based in Israel, but it's a country we of course study very deeply because of its storage potential. But really, as I mentioned in my speech, the rationale there for storage, and also as Yossi rightfully corrected, is more linked to, I would say, limitations to the grid, and as Yossi explained, essentially having a better management of the dispatch, the cost of energy. So what you're seeing in the UK, I think there was a question from Valentin from Tesla at some point there in the flood of questions about, are they thinking in Israel to deploy something like in the UK regarding some kind of synthetic inertia response based on batteries? I have not seen any kind of study this way, but maybe Yossi, you have some ideas if there's some incoming stability issues on the Israeli grid.
So when the goal for the 30% was set, there was a reference by IEC, or who is now in charge, and it will soon by reform be a different company, but today IEC is saying that yes, there are of course stability challenges to integrate that amount of renewables. And I think this is part of why we need
a lot of storage, because as we know, storage can really help us, and for frequency containment, not too much of the storage has to be dedicated to that. Regarding the way, and I think this is a question that you referred to, Michael, regarding the way that we're gonna allow the storage to come online, or saying, will we open the market for ancillary services? So our intermediate or long-term goal would be to have, of course, have markets for flexibility and frequency containment, and maybe more. Today, as Eitan said, we did our reform 2 years ago, and we're still on very much focused on completing the energy market. We have half-hourly prices, but we're still not there yet, and so we are focusing a lot of our energy on the energy market. And ancillary services today are given by IC units, or units that are let's say rented by the IC in the lease. And of course we would like to see that coming online. It depends what we'll do first. If we're able to open those markets before we need the ancillary services, we'll do it. And if not, we'll maybe do dedicated auctions for storage to give us that dedicated service.
Right. So in a lot of countries, I guess that value stacking is about giving energy storage a business case from a number of different revenue streams. But with this particular tender, it's structured around a PPAs, in order to reward those units, I guess. So we got a couple more questions specifically on that tender, actually. So if we can go through, I don't know if we can answer these both at the same time, or see if we can go one after the other. But Marcus Strauff asks, in relation to the PPAs, power purchase agreements, is the off-taker willing to accept international arbitration? And do PPAs include credit enhancement in case of rating downgrades? Now, I don't know if you want to directly answer those, or maybe just talk us through anything else particular about the PPAs and the structuring that you think people might need to know, that they might be different in some ways to PPAs that they might have received in other markets, for example.
So I have to admit that my mom is an English teacher, and I'm not sure that I understood the question completely, so I'm glad she's not online here. But if the question refers to the indexation of the price, so as I said, the indexation is to the CPI, to the Israeli CPI, and by choice you can choose the percentage of indexation to the dollar and to the euro, and of course to the Israeli shekel. So I hope that answers the question, and if not, you can maybe more specify what's missing.
Okay, well, I think your English is excellent, Yossi, and I wasn't entirely sure myself. I mean,
you have our emails there. You see
Yeah.
our emails on the screen, so you feel free to I don't know, to ask questions. There you go.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks. Thank you, Marcus, for your question. And of course, for all of you watching, if you do have further things that you'd like to discuss with our speakers, as you can see, their email addresses are on screen, and I'm sure they'll be very happy to take on any discussion that you'd like to bring to them. So Suna asks about the first PV and storage tender, or perhaps it refers to this one as well, but what type of energy storage do you think will be used?
I can take that. So, I mean, it's I don't think there's any provision in the tender. I'm pretty sure there's any provision for the nature of the type of the storage facilities that you can use. There's some indication. Well, let me say this. It's probably, well, if you look at 99% of the projects that have been announced over the past, say, 12 months, they've all been working with lithium-ion batteries. First indication. Then second indication, and I believe it also, by answering this, I'm going to answer. There was another question there asking if you were incentivized. I think there was a gentleman from EOS who was asking if you were incentivized for a specific charge or discharge pattern on your battery. Well, I'm going to answer those two at the same time, simply because the standard has a provision, as I mentioned in my speech, that says they'll take into account some of your losses, and so they've designed, they have a parameter in the standard that they call, I think, a normative efficiency, and they say, well, the typical efficiency should be 87%. Well, 87% is very, very close to the round-trip efficiency, including all transformer losses and air conditioning and all that you get from a lithium-ion battery. So it doesn't say in the tender that you have to bid with lithium-ion battery, but it says that they more or less take care of your losses if they compare with that of lithium-ion batteries. And like I said, the market is clearly looking at lithium-ion. Now, if you think you have something better or cheaper, of course, absolutely do it, because in the end, it's going to be an auction, so you're going to be judged on the final tariff.
Yeah, of course, and yeah, we do know that there are players outside of lithium-ion kind of looking to make their inroads into energy storage, and yeah, we'll wait and see what happens there. Okay, so there's been a few questions, actually dozens of questions come in the last few minutes. We are not going to get through all of them, obviously. We only have a few minutes left, but there's been, I think, more than one question on a similar topic, and it's one that James Trudeau asked, and it's the desire for multiple distributed PV plus storage sites or for fewer larger sites. And also, if we can take this on at the same time, someone else asked, and forgive me, I didn't see the name. Someone else asked if these are going to be all, any standalone storage sites, or if they need to be co-located on site with solar plants. So I guess that relates to available grid connections and things like that. But I guess, in terms of distribution of these kinds of projects, what your thinking is around that, I guess.
So maybe I'll take I'll try to answer both, and of course be free to add. Regarding the size of the plants, so it's for the distribution level. So the distribution level in Israel, about 15 megawatts is the upper limit for the storage. And as you saw, we tendered out 168 megawatts. So of course, we expect them to be in several locations and not in one location. Anything up to 15 or just thereabout, don't take, of course, it's a bit more specific, but around 15 megawatts is okay. We don't have a preference if it's 5 or 15. And this is for the tenders that we did and for the upcoming one. And I think the second question, if you're talking about standalone, we do require it to be with PV, but more than the requirement, it's something that we think is economically embedded in the tender, because basically your tariff is higher than if it would be a tender for only PV. So therefore, for each kilowatt hour, you get more money to recover the PV. So you would, I think, we designed the auction to people to enhance as much as they can the PV. So I don't know if there is, we want it to be PV plus storage, but we think the economics takes care of it better than our requirement.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I think we're more or less running out of time as it goes, but I guess just to finish off, do you want to just let people know the timelines? Obviously they can, have a look for themselves, but do you want to let people know the timelines that are remaining around the tender? And also a question I had was that the first one awarded, first tender awarded about 672 megawatt hours of energy storage, but my understanding is a fairly open-ended solicitation for this one. So I don't know if you have an idea of how much capacity is likely to be awarded, or if that's just speculation at this point. But yeah, do you want to just round off the day and let everyone know what the timelines are, what they can still do to get involved, and how much of an opportunity is available here, I guess.
So sure, but The auction is basically you have to bid in by the end of December. I don't remember the exact date, but of course you can see it online by the end of December. I don't think it's a complicated tender. There are like 8 attachments that you have to fill out, or 8 or 9, I don't remember the exact number. And you just bid in. You don't have to show which project you are doing. You can do that afterwards. You just tender out an amount, and afterwards you locate it where you want. I think that around sums it up. So you have like around 1 month, a bit more, until the offers are due. And of course, if anyone wants, we can send them a link to the where all the documents are. So that's a good starting point.
Okay, and so the closing one, are there any other comments that any of you gentlemen on the panel would like to add, or any of these questions that you think we can quickly answer just before we go? Michael?
Yeah, well, but there's plenty questions about, I guess, the permitting and the norms, so it's complicated to enter this in just an email. But I think that latest question there was just to confirm: does one need to be pre-qualified for the December 2020 deadline tender? I think the answer is no. You can just go ahead and bid. Why not just do it?
No, there's no PQ in this tender.
Okay, so they should get in touch with you, Michael, at Clean Horizon. Find out how to do it, and then get in touch with Yossi, I guess.
I didn't say that. I
did.
Yes.
Okay.
And for ourselves as an NGO here, an organization, our role is actually to push forward the renewables and storage market. We will be more than happy to answer any question, data, and assist your efforts if you would like to hear more about the Israeli electricity market.
Absolutely. I mean, as a journalist, I look forward to speaking with you all again, obviously, very soon. And I mean, there's questions on all sorts of other topics like residential storage, behind the meter storage, which you did cover briefly, Yossi, as well, but I guess people might want to talk about too. Okay. Well, I guess with all things being said, thank you very, very much to all of you for joining us. And that ends our webinar for today. I guess if any of the panelists have a couple more minutes, they can still answer the questions in the tab on the right-hand side. But for all that, we're switching off our cameras now and saying thank you very much for joining us.
All right.
For now.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.